Our next speaker is Paul Elliman. He actually was part of the kind of first introductory test event, a graphic designer. In this evening or this morning, I don't know, kind of, I lost a little bit the sense of time. I have suggested to your colleague Seville that basically graphic designer is the most important profession in the world today. And I would like to kind of suggest the same to you. And while he totally agreed with me and didn't seem too unhappy about it, I noticed when I first met you that you emanate a kind of anxiety about that issue. Oh.
An anxiety about everything. Getting up on time. I mean, on the one hand, I've got a kind of he has a fairly fraught relationship with the profession of graphic design anyway, for various reasons, and I also have similarly fraught relationship with the industry, with the profession or the industry, but for different reasons, I think. I mean, I've kind of said in the past something like, you know, whatever it is that I lack in. I mean, Peter Saville lacks nothing in professionalism. Let's be clear on that. Myself, on the other hand, probably lack a few things. And I'd said something about whatever it is that I lacked in professionalism, I tried my hardest to make up for in ambivalence to the profession. And for me, I actually agree with what you're saying, but I think my interest in graphic design is in terms of graphic design as a cultural form, as a powerful cultural form, a kind of communicational economy, an essential part of the. Joseph Beuys said something about the money being the bloodstream of the world. Graphic design, in terms of a communicational force or form, that's what it is. I think that's kind of what you're touching on in terms of its importance, and that's what interests me about graphic design, but doesn't interest me enough to have any desire to have run a kind of practice or a career in graphic design. So I'm kind of, in a way, I'm kind of more of a parasite on that profession. But I think I do agree. Many parts of my body and mind agree with what you're saying about it.
I love the word ambivalence because it's a kind of luxury that very few in this decade, which Hans doesn't stop repeating us, still doesn't have a name, can afford. How can you afford it? And what is your economy that allows you to afford it?
Well, I'd like to say that I've perfected a technique for counterfeiting money perfectly, but that obviously isn't true. It's very difficult. I mean, you find different ways to afford it. So I don't have a kind of I don't have any kind of devout faith in any particular professional pursuit or anything. So I don't feel sort of overly committed to any one thing, but I think. It's a case of finding other ways and diversifying your practice in ways that allow you to explore the things that you're interested in through other forms and other ways. I mean, writing, for example, I probably make a living as it's probably fair to say that I make a living as a writer far more than anything else. But then I choose the things that I'm writing about. They tend to be the same things that I'm, if you like, making design about, if I'm making work like that.
I was also curious to know a little bit more about your form of resisting the virtual, because your work sort of very often uses sort of test patterns or typefaces or the human voice or all kinds of moments of resistance to the purely virtual, and I think that also in an interesting way relates to our attempt here in a fragmentary way to sort of map the city, because Scott Lash talked earlier about the sort of different senses of mapping the city: taste, hearing, balance, smell, seeing, touching. And I mean, one of the most interesting things we found in our research here for the London Marathon was actually your interview with the voice of the London subway. So right. To make this long question short, I wanted to ask you to tell us the story about this London subway voice, and then maybe in more general terms about these different senses and eventual resistance to the virtual.
I mean, it's not as if I'm kind of, you know, I have room for the virtual. I mean, in terms of a kind of dialectical situation, I have room for the virtual, but I also realize that everything is manifest through a kind of materialism and through the body or through people or through things. So, you know, you have to kind of balance that relationship. In terms of language, I'm interested in the way that our language is produced, and one of the forms in which it's produced and produces us is through typography. Typography kind of spins off into every aspect of modernity, mass production, standardization. These are all things that, in fact, you could be shown to begin with typography. But another way in which the way in which language is produced is through the voice, through this simple example of the voice being produced or reproduced, but also in extremely interested in the use of recorded voices for public spaces. And that's becoming, you know, through the 20th century and speeding up with new media into where we are now, becoming far more ubiquitous. There was Derrida had gone into great length to talk about apprehending a category of language that connects writing with speaking. And I think that the recorded voices that we hear on public transport or in public spaces are a very acute example of that, because these have become fixed texts. The voice of London Underground, the primary voice of London Underground, of three of the lines anyway, is Emma Clark, and I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation with her, because these are voices that these are kind of monologues that you're not supposed to have a dialogue with. But it's actually a person has provided that voice. So I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation with her. And I've been trying to somehow apprehend these voices all over the world, apprehend them in terms of what they are in terms of a cultural or social form, a thing, and apprehend them in terms of the person that's providing them, because I'm particularly interested in the voices that are human voices. Of course, I'm interested in the idea of synthesizing a voice or language modeling a voice and a fully electronic voice, but most of the voices, and I think they for a long time they will be, well, in fact, there's already software that allows you to construct a voice from voice patterns in a recorded voice. So in the future, you can have anybody who's left enough of a recording of their voice to make it. And I think people will always want to there has to be something familiar about that voice. I just don't think, I've got a tape here, it's very short. And it's
great if you can see it.
This is a recording. This is a thing that I've just made in Madrid. And I'm doing a piece of work for a gallery in Madrid in January at the time of Arco. And I was quite curious about the two voices of the Madrid subway, which is a male and female. New York has a male and female on the new trains. That you're familiar with the guy who says, "Stand clear at the closing doors, please." And then he's always giving these kind of words of advice or kind of take care of the, you know. And the woman is always giving the information that you need. The next stop is Spring Street, or change here for whatever. The way that it works in Madrid is a much tighter, much more tightly choreographed speech, where the female voice completes the male voice's sentences. So the guy will say, the next station is, the próxima estación es, and she will answer by saying, Alonso Martinez, or whatever the station is. Then he will say, correspondencia con, and she will say, línea una. So I've managed to get hold of these two people. It's a guy called Javier Dotu and a woman called Maria Jesus Alvarez. So these are real people. You can touch them sometimes, and you can make them laugh. They're ticklish, and it turns out that Maria Jesus is a voice from Spanish radio, and Javier is a voice from Spanish cinema. He's a doblero, and it turns out that he's actually the voice to Spanish cinema going public. He's the voice of Al Pacino, which is a bit of a bonus. So I've got them here describing how to get from the gallery in the middle of Madrid to my office, which isn't so far from where Ian lives, in Hackney, actually in Bethnal Green. Starts off with a funny jingle, if it works.
Make it loud enough.
Estás en Pilar Parra y Romero, Galería de Arte, ubicada en la calle Conde de Aranda, número 2, Madrid.
Y quieres ir al número 84 de Teesdale Street, Londres.
Gira a la derecha al salir de la galería
Y camina a lo largo de la calle Conde de Aranda.
gira a la derecha en la calle La Gasca y camina hasta la estación de metro.
Retiro.
Coge la línea 2 hasta...
Príncipe de Vergara.
Cambia a la línea 9 y ve hasta...
Colombia.
Correspondencia con...
Línea 8.
y ve hasta la estación...
Aeropuerto de Barajas.
Dirígete a la terminal 4, a los mostradores de British Airways
So this is the
o de
point where they're
Iberia
actually leaving
para
Madrid
volar
now, because we're at the airport
Londres Heathrow.
and
Al
arriving in
llegar al
London,
aeropuerto de Londres
which they're not
Heathrow,
supposed to do, right?
coge el Paddington Express hasta la estación de...
Paddington.
De la estación de Paddington, trasládate con la línea circular del metro, dirección este, hasta...
Liverpool Street.
Desde la
And
parada
this is where it
de
gets a little bit
Liverpool
frightening for me,
coge
because they're getting
El
closer
autobús número
and
48
closer.
o el autobús número 26.
y bájate en...
That's
Hackney
number
Road
26 or
con Mansford
48.
Street.
Camina por...
Mansford Street,
y coge...
la segunda calle de la izquierda.
Continúa por...
Sheldon Place.
y gira a la derecha en...
Teesdale Street.
That's my street.
Camina por Teesdale Street hasta...
El número 84.
That's number 84. Where were we?
Scary.
The virtual.
Even for us. I have one observation. We all benefit and suffer from globalization. In kind of many of our cases, it has extended the territories where we can work. And even though I think graphic design is the most important and most powerful kind of force right now in the world, there's one almost comical limitation, which is that you're limited to Western script, and that an enormous part of the world is not using Western script, and that kind of probably Western script is shrinking in terms of its overall coverage.
How do you mean?
Well, I think there's more and more Chinese script, presumably more and more Japanese, Korean, Indian, Arabic, Russian, etc. So there is a kind of really very classical limitation to the kind of Western.
Except for in something like coding languages, for example, which are pretty much Western.
But for instance, are you interested, or do you work in other scripts, or have you, or
I haven't
would
really.
you feel confident enough, or
I think it's. I haven't. I mean, it's a that's a difficult situation to somehow accommodate, and maybe just also through not having enough experience in. I mean, you're acutely aware of this through working in China, and you know, I've made kind of brief visits to Seoul and to Tokyo, and for example, with my because I've got this huge archive of found characters. You know, I mean, I've been thinking about that for quite a long time. How would one find those characters in a Chinese script, for example? Because they're much more complex, and there would be composites. But one of the things that it kind of has, in a way, some aspect of that has made contact with my work, is that with this font that I've got of thousands of found characters, I was putting it into a program called OpenType, which allows the characters to be shuffled so that you could have 5 E's, for example, and never repeat them in a single word. And this is a program that was actually developed for Arabic characters, because some of the shapes change in once they come into contact, in a word with another letter, the shape can change. So OpenType was developed in a way for that to be keyboard accessible. But actually working with those characters isn't something that I've attempted to try to do. And yeah, I'm not sure how I would deal with that without working with somebody who was closely with somebody who was working in that context or way.
I have a very last question. I wanted to ask you about the unbuilt roads of Paul Elliman. Maybe to tell us about some of your unrealized or one of your unrealized projects, utopias or projects which have been too big or too small to be realized, or forgotten projects.
Well, one of them was because this is a famous question of yours, and one of them is still an answer that I gave you the first time you asked me that question, which was that I'd written to the BBC. This was about 15 years ago, but I'd written to the BBC to ask them if I could select my own readers for the shipping forecast, which is something that they broadcast 4 times a day, and is produced by the Meteorological Office. And there was something kind of contentious in that proposal when you think about the kinds of voices other than trained BBC voices that would be reading that forecast, and if you think about the implications of that, cultural implications of that forecast for this particular nation, for example, this island nation, 1 World Cup and 2 World Wars kind of thing. But I was really just thinking of using 7 of my friends whose voices I was familiar with, that weren't special voices in any kind of way, but just kind of normal, for me, normal voices, not trained voices. Because this was a project that was completely overlooked, deliberately overlooked by the BBC. As it happens, the Met Office is an executive agency of the Ministry of Defence, which I like, that aspect of it, but of course they're not going to have anybody play with that. And that's something that I would still like to realise, but it's not something that can be done as a kind of artwork. It's something that has to be real. I mean, if you know what I mean. I mean, it has to be done in real time through those institutional forms.
Many thanks, Paul Elliman. Thank you.
Great.